On a rainy night, long after the music had faded and the guests had gone, a single father in worn jeans stayed behind in a hall meant for the town's wealthiest. He wasn't paid, he wasn't asked, and he had no reason to be there. Yet he and his young daughter quietly began cleaning the chaos no one else noticed. What they didn't know was that a woman watching from above would change their lives forever. If you are new to the channel, then please subscribe to the channel and like the video and tell us where you are watching from. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below and let us know what you think. Now, let's jump into the story. The night had been filled with laughter, bright lights, and the clinking of glasses. But now the music was gone. In its place came the faint scrape of chairs on the polished floor and the soft rustle of garbage bags being tied shut. The charity gala at the Ridgeview Coastal Community Center was over, and the last of the guests were stepping out into the cool night air. Samuel stood in the shadow of the main entrance, his hands tucked deep into the pockets of a faded jacket. He was there to pick up his 9-year-old daughter, Lily, who had spent the evening inside at the birthday celebration of a new classmate. It wasn't just any party. It had been hosted by one of the wealthiest families in town. The kind of gathering where the decorations seemed more expensive than most people's cars, and where polished marble floors reflected the shimmer of chandeliers above. Lily had been invited because of a friendship made at her new private school, a place she attended only because of a scholarship. Samuel had been proud to see her fit in, but he could still see the flicker of doubt in her eyes when they'd walked up to the grand building earlier that evening. "We don't really belong here, do we?" she had whispered, her small hand tightening in his. "We belong anywhere we bring kindness," he'd told her, smiling, "and cupcakes don't check bank accounts." While Lily enjoyed the party, Samuel had waited outside on a wooden bench, sipping a paper cup of coffee from a vending machine. He'd watched as sleek cars pulled up to the curb, their doors opening to polished shoes and long dresses. The air had been filled with music then, the kind of music that seemed to make time pass slower. But now, with the event over, the scene had shifted. Guests hurried away to their next plans, late dinners, weekend getaways, or simply the warmth of their own homes. The large hall that had been alive with chatter now sat in a kind of weary silence. The staff, most of them young and clearly tired, moved slowly through the mess. Half-empty glasses were scattered across tables, crushed streamers stuck to the floor. Balloon ribbons sagged against the walls. It was the kind of aftermath that looked bigger than the hands available to clean it. Samuel hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. He didn't ask permission. He simply bent down and began stacking chairs, moving them neatly against the wall. He folded linen tablecloths and carried plates toward the kitchen door. He worked quietly, keeping his head down, careful not to get in anyone's way. His jacket grew warm from the effort, and his shoes picked up bits of confetti as he moved across the floor. Soon, Lily appeared at his side. Her blue party dress swayed as she bent to pick up paper napkins from under the tables. "You always say we should leave a place better than we found it," she said with a smile that carried more pride than complaint. Samuel smiled back, but kept working, glad for her company. Unseen by them, someone was watching. Margaret Hale, the woman who had organized the gala, stood on the balcony overlooking the hall. She was known in town as a successful businesswoman, but in that moment, she was simply a quiet observer. She leaned against the railing, her gray silk dress catching the light, her eyes following the steady, unhurried movements of the father and daughter. It wasn't the cleaning itself that held her attention. It was the way they moved without expecting thanks. There was no sense of obligation, No performance for others to notice. It was simple, honest action. Margaret descended the staircase slowly, her heels clicking softly against the floor. She approached from behind, her voice calm but curious. "Sir," she asked, "you don't work here, do you?" Samuel turned, surprised. His hand still held the edge of a folded tablecloth. "No, ma'am," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Just figured someone should help." Margaret studied him for a moment, her gaze steady, but not unkind. "And who are you?" she asked. Samuel hesitated. He could have told her he was a single father, juggling 2 jobs, trying to catch up on rent. He could have explained that his life was a patchwork of effort and hope. But instead, he gave a smaller truth, one that fit easily into a sentence. Just a dad trying to show his daughter that kindness doesn't come with a price tag. For a long moment, neither spoke. The faint sound of trash bags being carried out filled the quiet. Then Margaret's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. Before Samuel could wonder what she might say next, the scene faded. Not in the room itself, but in the mind of the listener. The unanswered question lingered like a held breath, drawing the audience forward into what would happen next. Earlier that evening, the community center had been alive with color and laughter. The sound of music floated into the street, and the glow from the tall windows spilled across the pavement like warm light from a fireplace. Samuel had walked Lily up the wide steps, her hand clutching his. Her eyes darting between the tall pillars and the guests stepping from shiny black cars. "Are you sure we belong here?" she had whispered. Samuel had smiled gently, his voice steady. "We belong wherever we bring kindness," he'd said. "And cupcakes don't check bank accounts." Lily had laughed, a soft sound, before disappearing into the party with her new friend. Samuel had stayed outside, finding a bench near the edge of the parking lot. The air was cool and smelled faintly of the ocean. He wrapped both hands around a paper cup of coffee, watching the way the street lamps caught in the chrome of expensive cars pulling up to the entrance. Guests arrived in glittering dresses and sharp suits, their laughter carrying in short bursts before the heavy doors closed behind them. Inside, Lily was playing games, trying new food, and joining in the singing. Samuel didn't go in. This was her evening, and he didn't want her to feel like she had to worry about him. When the party ended, the guests left quickly. Some exchanged quick goodbyes. Others hurried to their cars with the ease of people who had other places to be. But once the doors closed behind the last of them, the mess they left behind was clear. Tables scattered with half-empty glasses, colorful plates still holding crumbs of cake, ribbons tangled in the legs of chairs. Samuel had stepped through the doors without thinking much about it. He saw the staff, mostly young, tired and clearly outnumbered, trying to gather the clutter. They moved slowly, their voices low, the weight of the task making the hall seem bigger than it was. Samuel picked up a stack of plates, carried them toward the kitchen, and then began folding tablecloths. There was no rush, but there was purpose in his movements. Lily found him there. Her dress shimmered faintly under the lights as she bent to collect paper napkins from the floor. "You always say we should leave a place better than we found it," she reminded him, her tone light but proud. Samuel glanced at her and nodded. That's right. Together they worked, moving from one table to another, chatting quietly about the party and the people she had met. Above them, Margaret Hale had been watching. From the balcony, she could see the way the father and daughter moved together without needing to speak much. She could see that neither of them looked for attention. They didn't pause to see who might notice them, and they didn't work with the impatience of someone trying to finish a chore. There was something steady, almost gentle in their pace. Margaret was not the kind of person easily surprised, but this caught her off guard. She had spent years surrounded by people who expected reward for effort, people who measured worth in numbers and status. But here was a man in worn jeans and a girl in a party dress, giving their time to a room they didn't owe anything to. She descended the stairs, the sound of her heels soft against the polished wood. She approached them from behind and spoke first to Samuel. "Sir, you don't work here, do you?" He turned, still holding a folded tablecloth. "No, ma'am. Just figured someone should help." Margaret's gaze lingered on him for a moment before she crouched slightly to meet Lily's eyes. "And you're helping too?" Lily's answer came easily, as though it was the most obvious thing in the world. "We didn't want the place to feel lonely after everyone left." Margaret's lips curved faintly at the edges. She straightened, her eyes moving between them both. "Where are you staying?" she asked. Samuel hesitated before answering. "At a friend's place," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Just temporary." Margaret tilted her head, thinking. Then she said, "I have more rooms than I can count. Why don't you stay a few nights?" Samuel shook his head almost immediately. "I couldn't." "That's too much." "It's not charity," Margaret replied. "It's gratitude." Samuel looked at her, trying to read her expression, but there was no pity in her face. Instead, there was a kind of quiet sincerity. For a moment, the three of them stood in the quiet hall, the sound of staff moving in the background. It was an offer that didn't need to be answered right away, but something in Lily's hopeful gaze told Samuel that the choice might already be made. This was not the end of the night. In some ways, it was the beginning of something none of them could yet name. The first morning at Margaret Hale's estate felt almost unreal to Samuel. Sunlight streamed through wide windows in the guesthouse, painting soft patterns across the wooden floor. It was quiet in a way he hadn't experienced in years. No traffic noise, no leaky faucet dripping through the night, no neighbors arguing behind thin walls. Lily woke early, tiptoeing across the room to pull back the curtains. "It's like a storybook," she whispered, her eyes wide as she took in the rolling green lawns and the tall oak trees swaying gently in the breeze. Breakfast was served not in a grand dining room, but in the cozy sunroom of the main house. Margaret was already there, dressed simply, with a pot of tea and a plate of warm bread on the table. She greeted them as though they were old friends rather than unexpected guests. Conversation was easy. Margaret asked Lily about school and listened carefully to her answers. She asked Samuel about his work, and that was when she learned he had once run a small woodworking shop in town. The shop had closed during a downturn, leaving him to piece together a living through odd jobs, repairing furniture, painting houses, and anything else that could keep the bills from piling too high. Over the next few days, Samuel found himself drawn to the small repairs around the estate. He fixed a loose shutter on the guest house, mended a broken bench near the garden, and quietly unclogged a stubborn drain in the main house's kitchen. He didn't do it for recognition. It was simply in his nature to mend what was broken. Margaret noticed. One afternoon, she watched from the kitchen window as Samuel replaced a warped fence panel. There was focus in his movements, the same steady patience she had seen that night at the community center. Later, over tea, she remarked, "You're always fixing things." Samuel smiled faintly. "I guess I don't like seeing things fall apart." Lily was thriving too. She started joining after-school clubs, something she had been too shy to do before. Her grades improved, and she made friends who valued her laughter more than the shoes she wore. The change in her was subtle but steady, like the slow opening of a flower in spring. Margaret often joined them for dinner, and the conversations began to stretch long after the plates were cleared. They talked about books, about the town's history, and about the way small acts of kindness seemed to ripple farther than anyone expected. Weeks passed, and the guest house began to feel less like a temporary refuge and more like a home. Then, one evening, Margaret made an offer. She needed someone she could trust to oversee the maintenance of her properties, someone with skill, patience, and honesty. She told Samuel she believed he was the right person for the job. Samuel hesitated. He had always preferred working quietly, without the weight of formal titles. But Margaret assured him it was not a gift. It was earned work at fair pay. She wanted him to feel the stability he had been denied for too long. The job changed their days in small but meaningful ways. Samuel spent his mornings checking the estate's buildings, repairing what needed attention, and coordinating with local workers for larger projects. He came home each afternoon with his hands rough from labor, but his mind lighter than it had been in years. Lily grew used to seeing her father's tools neatly arranged in the guest house's small shed. She often helped him carry supplies or held the flashlight when he worked into the evening. She liked telling people, "My dad can fix anything." Through it all, Margaret remained a steady presence, not hovering, but always near. She valued the quiet rhythm they had built together. There were no grand gestures, no speeches about fate or luck. Just three people who had, without planning it, stepped into each other's lives in a way that made sense. Autumn came, painting the estate's trees in gold and rust. The air turned crisp, and the evenings grew shorter. Yet, inside the guest house, warmth filled the rooms. Samuel had work he could be proud of. Lily had friends and confidence. And Margaret had found something she had not realized she was missing, a daily reminder that generosity was not about money, but about presence. As the season deepened, an unspoken bond settled among them. They didn't call it family, but it felt close. It was a season of change, and for the first time in a long while, none of them wished it to end. The rain fell in soft sheets against the tall windows of Margaret Hale's dining room. The long table glowed under the warm light of a chandelier, its surface lined with polished silver and fresh flowers. Tonight was not a grand gala or a crowded charity event. It was a smaller, more intimate dinner for Margaret's closest friends and a few respected members of the community. Samuel had helped set the table earlier in the day, not as hired staff, but as someone who cared about the details. Lily had carefully placed folded napkins at each setting, her hands steady, her face focused. Now, dressed in her favorite blue dress, she sat beside him, her eyes bright with quiet pride. The evening began with easy conversation. Guests spoke about the stormy weather, the latest town projects, and the warm food laid before them. Samuel listened more than he spoke, but when asked about his work on the estate, he shared small stories about repairs, the garden, and the satisfaction of making things last. Halfway through the meal, a man at the far end of the table turned to Margaret with a curious smile. "How did you and Samuel meet?" he asked. The question made Samuel glance down at his plate, but he answered with a small grin. "I was just picking up after a party," he said. Laughter rose gently around the table, as though he had made a light joke. But Margaret didn't laugh. Instead, she set down her fork and looked at her guests with a steady expression. "That's true," she said, "but it's not the whole story." She spoke clearly, her voice carrying through the quiet room. "The night I met Samuel, the music had ended and the hall was a mess. People had gone home. Most wouldn't have noticed the chaos they left behind. But he stayed. He stayed when there was no reason to, when no one was watching, and when there was nothing to gain." She glanced toward Lily, who sat listening intently. And he didn't stay alone. His daughter helped too. Not because she was told to, but because she understood. They reminded me that real worth has nothing to do with wealth. It's about what you do when no one is keeping score. There was a pause. The only sound was the rain tapping against the glass. He didn't stay because I needed something, Margaret continued softly. He stayed because the place did. Because kindness is never wasted, even when it goes unseen. Samuel looked at her, unsure how to respond. There was no grand announcement, no expectation tied to her words. It was simply the truth, spoken plainly, and it seemed to rest in the room like a steady light. The conversation eventually moved on, but the tone of the dinner had shifted. Guests began sharing their own stories, moments when small acts had made a difference, times when they had received help without asking. The room felt warmer, not because of the fire in the hearth, but because of the way the words connected everyone there. After the plates were cleared, Margaret stood with Samuel by the doorway as guests prepared to leave. A few shook his hand, others patted his shoulder, their faces carrying an understanding they hadn't arrived with. When the house was quiet again, Samuel and Lily prepared to walk back to the guest house. Outside, the rain had eased to a mist, and the gardens glistened under the dim path lights. Lily slipped her hand into his and looked up at him. "You think we'll always live here?" she asked. Samuel didn't answer right away. "I think," he said slowly, "that wherever we are, we'll leave it better than we found it." Months later, the community center hosted another event. This time, Lily attended with her friends, laughing and moving easily among them. When the night ended and the guests left, she stayed behind to help fold chairs and collect stray cups. Samuel watched from the doorway, his jacket draped over his arm. He didn't need to tell her what to do. She already knew. Margaret was there too, speaking quietly with the event organizer, her eyes warm as she glanced toward the girl in the blue dress. The lights in the hall dimmed one by one, but the space didn't feel empty. Instead, it felt as though something unseen had been left behind. An understanding, a habit, but choice. Because sometimes the smallest hands carry the longest light. And sometimes the quiet moments after the music ends are where the truest stories begin.